It was one of those blistering hot summer days in the suburbs, where the streets were quiet, and the only sounds came from the occasional hum of a lawnmower or the distant shouts of kids playing. On a neatly trimmed lawn, just outside a modest but well-kept home, 10-year-old Marcus was busy setting up his lemonade stand. His excitement was infectious. The bright yellow sign he had painted the night before proudly declared lemonade 50 cents. And he had everything he needed: cups, ice, and his homemade lemonade chilled to perfection. Marcus was a bright and ambitious boy, always eager to learn new things and find ways to make a little money during the summer. This was his first attempt at a lemonade stand, and his heart swelled with pride as he adjusted the table to make sure everything looked just right. He had talked to his mom, Jasmine, about doing it as part of a community fundraiser that she had heard about at work. The plan was simple: sell lemonade, save a bit for himself, and donate the rest to a local charity, helping kids like him get better access to school supplies. As Marcus finished his setup, his mom came out to check on him, her face glowing with pride. "You all set?" baby Jasmine asked, her voice filled with warmth and encouragement. She was always proud of Marcus's drive to do something positive. "Yep, I'm ready to make some money," Marcus grinned, his face lighting up with excitement. His mother chuckled and reminded him to stay hydrated and not get too hot. "Don't forget, if it gets too warm, you come inside for a bit, okay?" "Okay, Mom," Marcus called back, already scanning the street for his first customer. It was the perfect day to sell lemonade. But across the street, Karen, a middle-aged white woman with a sharp eye for detail, sat on her porch, sipping iced tea and surveying the scene with thinly veiled disapproval. Karen was the self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood, always quick to point out what she saw as disturbances to the peace. And today, to her, Marcus and his lemonade stand were just that. "Not in my neighborhood," she muttered to herself as she watched Marcus. Something about seeing him there, right in front of his house, made her uncomfortable. It wasn't just the stand. It was the sight of a young black boy taking up space in what she believed was a quiet, respectable part of town. Karen's phone buzzed with a message from her friend, Linda, who lived a few blocks away. "Did you see that lemonade stand? What's going on?" the message read. Karen quickly responded, "Yes, I see it. Doesn't look good, does it? No permit, no nothing. I'll handle it." Karen didn't like things that felt out of place. And in her mind, Marcus's stand was exactly that. She placed her phone down, straightened up in her chair, and made her decision. Someone had to take control of this situation, and she was more than ready to step in. Karen stood up and walked across the street toward Marcus's stand, her sandals clacking on the pavement, making each step sound louder than the last. Marcus didn't notice her at first. He was too busy wiping down his table, making sure everything was clean for his next customer. "Well, what's going on here?" Karen's voice cut through the summer air like a knife. Marcus looked up, startled. He didn't know her well, but he had seen her before. She was one of those neighbors who never smiled, always watching but never really speaking. "I'm just selling lemonade," Marcus said cautiously, unsure why she was so close. "Do you have a permit for this?" Karen asked, folding her arms across her chest. Her expression was a mix of suspicion and disdain. "A permit?" Marcus echoed, confused. "It's just lemonade." "Well, in this neighborhood, we follow rules," Karen said sharply. "I don't think you're allowed to just set up shop wherever you want. This isn't the city." Marcus blinked, unsure of what to say. He had never heard of needing a permit for a lemonade stand. His mom said it was fine, and the other kids on TV never seemed to need one. Just then, Jasmine, noticing Karen's stern approach, stepped out of the house. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice firm but polite as she came up behind Marcus and put a hand on his shoulder. Karen's eyes darted from Marcus to Jasmine, her disapproval deepening. "I don't think it's appropriate for children to be running businesses out in the open like this without proper approval. It's a disturbance to the neighborhood," she said. Jasmine's face tightened. "It's just a lemonade stand. He's raising money for a local charity." Karen sniffed dismissively, as if the explanation wasn't good enough. "Be that as it may, there are rules. If you don't have permission, you need to take it down." Marcus looked up at his mom, confused and a little scared. Jasmine stood her ground, trying to remain calm. "I don't think selling lemonade is against the law. He's just a kid." "Well, we'll see about that," Karen snapped, already pulling out her phone. "If you don't take it down, I'll call the police and let them handle it." Marcus's eyes widened in fear. Jasmine's grip on his shoulder tightened, and she could feel the tension rising in her chest. She wasn't going to let Karen bully her son like this, but she also didn't want this to escalate. Karen tapped her phone furiously, determined to make her point clear. For her, this wasn't just about lemonade. It was about control, about keeping her neighborhood the way she wanted it. And just like that, what had started as a simple summer project for Marcus had turned into something much darker. Karen's phone was pressed tightly to her ear as she spoke with the police dispatcher, her voice tense but filled with self-righteous authority. Marcus watched in stunned silence, standing by his lemonade stand, unsure of what to do. Jasmine stepped closer to him, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this situation could escalate quickly, and the mere thought of the police showing up filled her with dread. "This is ridiculous," Jasmine muttered under her breath. She couldn't believe a neighbor would call the police over something as harmless as a lemonade stand, but in her gut she knew it wasn't just about the stand. Karen had been watching them for months, giving them cold glances at every opportunity, and now this. Karen's voice grew louder as she spoke into the phone. "Yes, I'm on Maple Street, right across from the park. There's a child here, yes, a black boy selling lemonade without a permit. I think he's causing a disturbance to the peace. Could you send someone out to take care of it?" Marcus looked up at his mom with wide eyes. "Am I in trouble?" "No, baby, you're not in trouble," Jasmine said firmly, giving him a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. But inside, she wasn't so sure. She had heard enough stories, seen enough news reports, to know how easily things could go wrong when the police got involved. And it scared her. "Just stay calm, okay?" Across the street, a few neighbors had come out onto their porches, watching the commotion unfold. Mrs. Ortega, who lived 2 houses down, was shaking her head in disapproval at Karen's behavior. "This is getting out of hand," she muttered to her husband. But like most of the neighbors, she stayed on her porch, too wary to get involved. Karen hung up the phone, her face tight with satisfaction. "The police will be here soon to sort this out," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. Jasmine clenched her jaw, fighting the urge to snap back. She had always taught Marcus to respect authority, to stay calm and polite in situations like these. But now, with her son being targeted over something so small, she struggled to hold back her frustration. "You called the police on a 10-year-old selling lemonade? What's wrong with you?" Jasmine asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Her tone was controlled, but her anger simmered just beneath the surface. Karen folded her arms across her chest, her stance firm. "Rules are rules. If you don't have a permit, you can't just set up shop wherever you want. This is a respectable neighborhood, and we don't allow things like this. You should have known better." Jasmine's eyes narrowed. "We've lived here for 3 years, and I've never seen anyone need a permit to sell lemonade. This is about more than just some neighborhood rule, isn't it?" Karen's lips tightened, but she didn't respond. She simply stood there, as if her silence was enough of an answer. Minutes passed, feeling like hours, as the small crowd of neighbors grew, their curiosity piqued by the sight of Karen standing in the middle of the street. Whispers floated through the air, some expressing support for Marcus, others quietly agreeing with Karen's rigid enforcement of the rules. Just as the tension reached its peak, the distant sound of sirens cut through the summer heat, drawing everyone's attention. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, and he instinctively reached for his mother's hand. Jasmine bent down, whispering in his ear, "It's going to be okay. I'm right here. You've done nothing wrong." The police car pulled up to the curb, and 2 officers stepped out. One, Officer Bennett, was an older man with a calm demeanor. He adjusted his sunglasses as he scanned the scene, clearly trying to assess the situation. The other, Officer Clark, was younger, with a more rigid posture and a stern expression. Karen immediately approached them, her voice shrill as she began explaining the problem. "Officers, thank you for coming. I've been trying to keep this neighborhood in order, and this boy has been running an illegal lemonade stand without a permit. It's creating quite a disturbance." Officer Bennett exchanged a glance with Officer Clark, then turned his attention to Jasmine and Marcus, who stood by the lemonade stand. He approached them with a measured calm, his eyes softening when they met Marcus's. "What's going on here?" Officer Bennett asked, his voice level, as he crouched down slightly to meet Marcus's eye level. "It's just lemonade," Marcus said quietly. "I'm raising money for school supplies for other kids. My mom said I could. Officer Bennett nodded slowly. That sounds like a good cause, young man. You've done this before. No, sir. This is my first time, Marcus replied, trying his best to stay composed under the weight of the officer's gaze. Jasmine stepped forward. He's not doing anything wrong. He's just selling lemonade. I don't understand why this needed police involvement. Officer Clark, who had been standing behind Bennett, stepped forward, his expression more serious. Do you have a permit, ma'am? Jasmine's eyes flashed with frustration. For a lemonade stand? No, I didn't know we needed one. Clark gave a small shrug. Rules are rules. Before the conversation could escalate further, Officer Bennett raised his hand, signaling Clark to stop. Let's not make this bigger than it is. It's a lemonade stand. He turned to Karen, whose smug expression faltered slightly. We'll take it from here, ma'am. Karen seemed taken aback, her confidence wavering. But they're breaking the law. Officer Bennett shook his head, his tone calm but firm. Ma'am, I don't see any harm being done here. This boy's just trying to do something good. Karen's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, but she had no words left to argue. She huffed and stepped back, folding her arms once more, waiting for the officers to act on her behalf. The officers exchanged a look, but it was clear the situation had already shifted. The small crowd of neighbors continued to gather, quietly watching the confrontation unfold. The tension in the air was palpable as Officer Bennett stood by Marcus's lemonade stand, still trying to defuse the situation. Officer Clark, however, was more rigid, his hand resting on his belt, clearly feeling that some form of action was necessary. Karen, standing a few feet away, was visibly annoyed by Officer Bennett's calm demeanor. She had expected the police to immediately shut down Marcus's stand, not engage in what seemed like a conversation. The neighborhood had rules, and in her mind this boy was clearly breaking them. She had gone through all the proper channels when she moved into this community, abiding by every regulation. So why was this different? The murmur of whispers from the onlookers grew louder. Some of the neighbors began to exchange worried glances, while others took out their phones, subtly recording the interaction. Jasmine, standing protectively by her son, could feel the weight of the neighborhood's gaze on them. She had been through situations like this before where it felt like all eyes were on her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. But this time it wasn't just her, it was Marcus, her son. And that thought sent a wave of both fear and anger crashing through her. Officer Jasmine said, her voice steady but firm, my son is just selling lemonade. There's no reason for this to have escalated like this. He's raising money for a good cause. We didn't know we needed a permit for something so small. Officer Bennett nodded, his expression understanding. I get that, Mom, he said. Honestly, I don't think this is as big a deal as it's being made out to be. He glanced back at Officer Clark, who looked less convinced but didn't object. Bennett then turned to Marcus, offering a reassuring smile. You're doing a good thing, kid. I used to sell lemonade when I was your age too. For a moment it seemed like the tension might dissipate, but Karen wasn't about to let things go so easily. This is not just about lemonade, Karen's voice rang out, her frustration boiling over. It's about following the rules. If we let things like this slide, what's next? These people, she caught herself, her eyes flicking toward Jasmine and Marcus, then back to Officer Bennett. These kinds of activities lower the standards of our neighborhood. We don't want our streets looking like some kind of carnival. Jasmine's eyes narrowed at the not-so-subtle racial undertone in Karen's words. Her fists clenched at her sides, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. She knew this wasn't the time to let her emotions take control. Marcus tugged at his mother's sleeve, looking up at her with wide, confused eyes. Mom, what does she mean? He asked, his voice trembling. Jasmine knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Don't worry about it, baby, she whispered, though her heart ached seeing the confusion and hurt in her son's face. Mrs. Ortega, who had been quietly watching the scene unfold, finally stepped forward. She was an older Latina woman who had lived in the neighborhood for years, always keeping to herself. But today, something inside her wouldn't allow her to remain silent. Karen, this is ridiculous, Mrs. Ortega said, her voice calm but firm. It's just a lemonade stand. The boy isn't hurting anyone. Karen whipped around, her face flushed with indignation. It's not about that, Maria. It's about keeping things orderly. We have standards here. Mrs. Ortega crossed her arms, her gaze steady. Standards are one thing. Being a bully is another. A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Karen's eyes darted around as she realized that not everyone was on her side. Her grip tightened on her phone, still clutched in her hand, but she held back from responding. It was clear that her control over the situation was slipping. Meanwhile, Officer Clark, still unsure of how to handle the escalating emotions, stepped forward, addressing Jasmine more sternly this time. Ma'am, regardless of the intentions, if there are regulations in this neighborhood, you'll need to follow them. Otherwise, we're going to have to shut this down. Jasmine stood up, her eyes locking with Clark's. I understand that, officer, but this was supposed to be a simple fundraiser. There was no harm intended here. Fundraiser or not, we have rules, Clark replied, his tone unyielding. Permits exist for a reason. Before the conversation could go any further, another voice cut through the crowd. Mr. Green, the elderly president of the Homeowners Association, had arrived on the scene, leaning heavily on his cane as he made his way through the group of neighbors. What's going on here? Mr. Green asked, his voice carrying a weight of authority that instantly silenced the murmuring crowd. Karen immediately turned toward him, her expression one of relief. Mr. Green, thank goodness you're here. This boy has been running a lemonade stand without a permit. I called the police because this needs to be handled properly. Mr. Green raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting from Karen to Marcus, then to the officers. A lemonade stand, you say? Karen nodded eagerly. Yes, and it's creating quite a disturbance. Mr. Green slowly shook his head, clearly unimpressed with Karen's dramatics. You called the police. Over lemonade. The question hung in the air, and for the first time, Karen's confidence wavered. She opened her mouth to respond but found herself at a loss for words. Mr. Green didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he turned to Jasmine and Marcus, his expression softening. Ma'am, he said to Jasmine, I'm sorry this has happened. I heard about the fundraiser your son is doing, and I think it's a wonderful thing. In fact, he paused. Turning back to the officers, Marcus was granted special permission by the Homeowners Association to run his stand as part of a community initiative. Officer Bennett's face lit up with relief, and he quickly nodded. Well, that settles it then. Seems like there's no problem here. Clark, on the other hand, shifted uncomfortably. He had been so firm in upholding the rules that he now felt awkward in the face of this new information. I see, he muttered, stepping back. Karen, meanwhile, was visibly flustered. Special permission, she repeated, incredulity creeping into her voice. I wasn't informed of this. Mr. Green's gaze settled firmly on Karen. That's because we didn't think it would be an issue, he said, his voice calm but pointed. This is a good cause. Marcus here is raising money for local kids to get school supplies, and the Homeowners Association fully supports it. Karen's face flushed red, her lips pressing into a thin line. She looked around, suddenly aware of the crowd of neighbors staring at her. Some were whispering among themselves, while others openly shook their heads in disapproval. She had lost control of the situation, and the realization hit her like a wave. Marcus, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide eyes, looked up at his mother. Jasmine gave him a soft smile, brushing a hand through his hair. See, baby, everything's going to be fine. As the officers began to wrap up their involvement, the crowd slowly began to disperse. Mrs. Ortega shot one last disapproving look at Karen before walking back to her house, and the other neighbors followed suit, quietly murmuring about what had just happened. Karen stood there, frozen, her face a mask of humiliation. Mr. Green offered her a polite but firm nod before turning to leave, his cane tapping against the sidewalk as he walked away. It was clear that the neighborhood had spoken, and Karen, for all her attempts to assert control, had found herself on the wrong side of this battle. As the neighbors started to drift back into their homes, murmuring amongst themselves about Karen's behavior, the tension in the air remained thick. The confrontation may have ended for some, but for Marcus and Jasmine, the emotions of the moment still weighed heavily. Marcus stood quietly beside his mother, gripping the edge of his lemonade stand, his young mind still trying to process what had just happened. Karen, now standing alone in the middle of the street, was visibly embarrassed, her face flushed as she watched the neighbors disperse. The sting of public humiliation hit her hard, She had never imagined that things would turn out like this, with her being the one chastised by the community. She looked over at Marcus's stand and felt a bitter mix of anger and confusion. How had she ended up the villain in what she believed was a righteous attempt to uphold order? Officer Bennett approached Jasmine, his face softening. I'm sorry about all this, he said quietly. It seems like there's been a misunderstanding. Jasmine nodded, still holding Marcus close. Thank you, officer. I appreciate you stepping in. Bennett glanced down at Marcus and smiled warmly. Keep doing what you're doing, kid. Don't let all this stop you. Marcus gave him a small nod, still too shaken to say much. Bennett tipped his cap and started toward his patrol car, but Officer Clark lingered, still looking uncomfortable. He cleared his throat, his rigid posture softening just a little. Clark started, addressing Jasmine. I was just doing my job, enforcing the rules. I didn't mean for it to get so heated. Jasmine, though still frustrated by the entire situation, could sense a slight shift in his tone. I understand, officer, she replied. But you have to realize these situations, she paused, choosing her words carefully. They affect us differently. When the police get involved, it can be more than just a simple rule being enforced. Clark looked down for a moment, as if her words had struck something in him, but he didn't respond. He simply nodded and walked back to his car. As the officers drove away, Jasmine knelt beside Marcus, brushing a stray tear from his cheek. Are you okay, baby? She asked softly. Marcus nodded, but there was a lingering sadness in his eyes. Why did she call the police on me, Mom? I didn't do anything wrong. Jasmine's heart broke at his question, one she wished she didn't have to answer. No, baby, you didn't do anything wrong, she assured him. Some people, they just don't understand. They see things the wrong way, and it's not fair. Marcus looked up at her, his young mind trying to grasp the complexities of prejudice. But it was still too big for him to fully comprehend. But why me? He asked again, his voice smaller this time. Jasmine sighed, her eyes softening as she hugged him close. Because you're different, Marcus. And sometimes people don't know how to handle that, but that doesn't mean you should ever stop being who you are. Marcus leaned into his mother's embrace, feeling a mix of confusion and comfort. He had learned something today, something heavy, something his young heart wasn't fully ready for, but it was there now, lingering in the back of his mind. Just as Jasmine was about to take Marcus inside to rest, Mr. Green, the president of the Homeowners Association, slowly walked back toward them. He moved with a slight limp, his cane tapping rhythmically on the pavement. Marcus, he called out as he approached. Jasmine turned to face him, curious about what he had to say. I just wanted to say how sorry I am that this happened. What your boy is doing here, it's a wonderful thing. Jasmine smiled gratefully. Thank you, Mr. Green. I appreciate you stepping in. Mr. Green nodded. I'm just sorry I didn't get here sooner. Marcus, you should be proud of what you're doing. It's not easy to take the initiative like this, especially when you're trying to help others. Marcus, still feeling a bit shy, managed a small smile. Thanks, sir. Mr. Green looked over at Karen, who was still standing across the street, clearly deflated by how the situation had turned out. His face hardened for a moment before he turned back to Jasmine and Marcus. You know, he said, this isn't the first time I've had to deal with this kind of thing in our community. He sighed deeply. There are always a few people who think they know what's best for everyone else. But let me tell you, what's best for this neighborhood is people like you, Marcus. People who care about others. Karen, overhearing Mr. Green's words, felt a wave of anger and embarrassment wash over her. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, but she couldn't find the words. The truth was, deep down, she knew she had overreacted. But admitting that to herself, let alone to the neighborhood, was another story. As Mr. Green continued to praise Marcus, Karen's phone buzzed in her hand. It was a text message from one of her friends in the neighborhood. She opened it, hoping for some support, but what she saw made her heart sink. Karen, what were you thinking? This looks really bad. You should have just left it alone. Karen's face flushed with shame as she glanced around at the few remaining neighbors still watching her. She suddenly felt very small, as if the world had shifted beneath her feet. For the first time, she was beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, she was the one in the wrong. Across the street, Jasmine could feel the change in the air. She had seen this before, this slow, painful realization in people like Karen, when they finally started to understand the harm they had caused. Jasmine didn't feel triumphant. There was no joy in watching someone unravel like this. But there was a sense of relief that, at least for now, the situation had been resolved without any real harm coming to Marcus. Mr. Green gave Marcus a pat on the shoulder before turning to leave. "You keep doing what you're doing, son, and if you need anything, you come to me." As he walked away, Jasmine and Marcus stood by the lemonade stand, watching the last few neighbors retreat into their homes. The street was quiet again, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air, like the heat of the afternoon sun. Karen, now standing alone, finally looked over at Jasmine and Marcus. For a moment, their eyes met across the street. Karen opened her mouth as if to say something, but then stopped. She wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked back to her house, her steps slow and heavy, the sting of her actions hanging over her like a cloud she couldn't shake. For Karen, the realization of her own prejudice was just beginning, and it would take time she wasn't sure she was ready to face. As Jasmine packed up the lemonade stand, Marcus looked up at her and asked, "Mom, is she going to be okay?" Jasmine smiled softly, brushing a hand over his cheek. "I think so, baby. But it's going to take her a while to figure some things out." They finished cleaning up the stand and headed inside, leaving the street quiet once more. The day had been long, but the lessons learned by everyone involved would last far longer. The late afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows over the quiet suburban street. Jasmine and Marcus had finished packing up the lemonade stand, the remnants of the day tucked neatly away in the garage. The chaotic energy that had filled the air just hours earlier had dissipated, leaving behind a strange stillness. Inside their cozy home, Jasmine made Marcus a snack while he sat at the kitchen table, drawing in his notebook. He seemed quieter than usual, his usual bright enthusiasm dimmed by the events of the day. Jasmine watched him carefully as she poured him a glass of milk, her heart heavy with the knowledge that today had changed something in her son. She had always known that a moment like this might come, a moment when the innocence of childhood would be touched by the harsh realities of the world. But it still hurt to see it happen. "Mom," Marcus said quietly, not looking up from his drawing. "Why did she get so mad at me?" Jasmine sat down across from him, choosing her words carefully. "It wasn't really about you, baby," she began softly. "Sometimes people get scared of things they don't understand, and instead of trying to learn or be kind, they lash out. It's not fair, and it's not right, but it happens." Marcus frowned, still drawing. "But I wasn't doing anything wrong. I just wanted to sell lemonade to help people." "I know," Jasmine said, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart. You were doing something good. And that's why so many people stood up for you today." Marcus stopped drawing and looked up at his mother. "Does that mean she doesn't like me because I'm black?" The question hit Jasmine like a punch to the gut, but she had prepared herself for it. This was a conversation every black parent feared but knew was inevitable. She took a deep breath and reached across the table, taking Marcus's hand in hers. "Some people have a hard time seeing past the color of someone's skin," Jasmine explained gently. "They let their fear and their prejudice get in the way of seeing the real person. It's wrong, but it's something people like us have to deal with sometimes." Marcus's brow furrowed. "But I don't get it. Why does it matter what color I am?" Jasmine smiled sadly. "It shouldn't matter, baby. It really shouldn't. But some people have been taught to think it does. And that's something we're all trying to change, little by little." Marcus stared at his drawing, a picture of his lemonade stand with smiling faces around it, and nodded slowly. "I'm still going to sell lemonade," though, he said, his voice steady with determination. Jasmine's heart swelled with pride. "Good," she said, squeezing his hand. "Don't let anyone stop you from doing good." Just as the tension in the room began to ease, there was a soft knock at the door. Jasmine and Marcus exchanged a glance, and for a moment, a flicker of worry crossed Jasmine's mind. But she stood up, brushing her hands on her jeans, and headed toward the door. When she opened it, there stood Karen. Her face was a mixture of shame, exhaustion, and something else, regret, perhaps. She held her hands awkwardly in front of her, her eyes unable to meet Jasmine's. For a moment, the two women stood there in silence, the weight of everything that had happened between them filling the space like a thick fog. Can I talk to you?" Karen finally asked, her voice small and uncertain. Jasmine studied her for a moment, then stepped aside, allowing Karen to step inside. Karen hesitated for a second, then slowly entered the home, her eyes darting around, taking in the warmth of the space. It was a stark contrast to the coldness she felt inside herself. Marcus, still seated at the kitchen table, looked up in surprise when he saw Karen enter. His hand instinctively gripped his pencil tighter, his young face clouded with uncertainty. Jasmine walked back to the kitchen, gesturing for Karen to follow. "Marcus," she said softly, "why don't you go play in your room for a little bit?" Marcus hesitated, glancing at Karen, but nodded. He slid off his chair and made his way to his room, casting one last curious glance at Karen before disappearing down the hall. Once Marcus was gone, Karen stood awkwardly in the kitchen, wringing her hands as she searched for the right words. Jasmine waited, leaning against the counter, her arms crossed but her face calm, showing no sign of hostility. Karen began, her voice trembling slightly. "I wanted to come by and apologize." Jasmine didn't respond immediately, waiting for her to continue. Karen's eyes finally met Jasmine's, and they were filled with a mixture of shame and guilt. "I acted out of line today. I don't know why I got so upset. It wasn't right. I didn't think about how I was making you and Marcus feel. She sighed, frustrated with herself. "I just saw something that I thought didn't belong, and I reacted. And that was wrong. I was wrong." Jasmine studied Karen for a long moment. She could see the sincerity in her eyes, the struggle within her as she confronted her own behavior. Part of Jasmine wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the pain and frustration of what had happened. But another part of her, a part that had been raised to believe in forgiveness and understanding, knew that this was an opportunity for something more. "I appreciate your apology," Jasmine said quietly, though her tone was measured. "But you need to understand, this wasn't just about a lemonade stand for us." Karen nodded quickly, tears forming in her eyes. "I know, I see that now. I didn't think about how it would look, or how it would feel for you. I just reacted, and I've been thinking about it all afternoon, and I realize how awful I was." Jasmine uncrossed her arms and stepped closer, her eyes softening. "It's not easy to face that," she said gently, "but it's a step, and we all have to start somewhere." Karen wiped a tear from her cheek, her hands shaking slightly. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Jasmine nodded slowly. "I can see that you are, and I hope moving forward we can all be better. For Marcus, for the neighborhood, for everyone." Karen nodded, swallowing hard. "I'll try." With that, Karen turned to leave, her shoulders slumped as though the weight of the day was still heavy on her back. But as she reached the door, she paused and glanced back at Jasmine. "I hope Marcus knows. I didn't mean to hurt him." Jasmine's voice was firm but kind. "I'll make sure he knows." Karen nodded again and slipped out the door, leaving Jasmine standing in the quiet house, the echo of the day's events still fresh in her mind. The evening had settled in by the time Karen left, the sun casting a soft orange glow over the neighborhood as it dipped below the horizon. Jasmine stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her neighbor's figure retreat into the distance. She let out a long breath, feeling the emotional weight of the day starting to lift. The house was quiet now, save for the faint sound of Marcus playing in his room, a reminder that life moved on, even after difficult moments like these. Jasmine closed the door softly and made her way back to the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of water, leaning against the counter, reflecting on the day. Karen's apology had been sincere, but Jasmine knew that apologies were only the first step. Forgiveness was a process, one that took time and more than just words. Today had brought to the surface so many emotions: anger, fear, pride, and it would take more than an apology to heal the wounds inflicted by Karen's actions. But Jasmine was hopeful that, with time, Karen would begin to truly understand the depth of her behavior. Jasmine was still deep in thought when Marcus appeared in the doorway of the kitchen holding one of his toys. "Mom, was that lady saying sorry?" he asked, his innocent eyes still filled with questions. Jasmine smiled softly and gestured for him to come sit with her at the kitchen table. "Yeah, baby, she was. She wanted to apologize for what she did today." Marcus climbed into the chair next to her, resting his chin on his hand as he considered this. But why did she act so mean if she didn't really hate me? Jasmine brushed a hand through his hair, her touch gentle. Sometimes people do things that don't make sense even to them. They act out of fear or confusion or because they don't know any better. Karen was wrong today, but she's trying to learn from it. Marcus thought about this for a moment, then nodded slowly. Do we have to forgive her? Jasmine smiled at her son's perceptiveness. Forgiving someone doesn't mean you have to forget what they did, or that it didn't hurt, she explained gently. It just means you're choosing not to let that hurt control you. It means you're giving yourself the freedom to move on. Marcus was quiet for a few moments, then looked up at his mom, his eyes filled with a determination beyond his years. I think I can forgive her, he said, his voice soft but steady. But I'm not going to forget what happened. Jasmine's heart swelled with pride. That's a very mature way to look at it, she said, leaning down to kiss the top of his head. I'm proud of you, Marcus. They sat in silence for a little while longer, the soft ticking of the kitchen clock the only sound between them. It had been a long, difficult day, but in that moment, Jasmine felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for her son's strength and resilience. She had always known that Marcus was special, but today had shown her just how deeply that strength ran. Eventually, Marcus stood up, looking toward the front door. Can I still sell lemonade tomorrow, he asked, a flicker of hope returning to his eyes. Jasmine smiled warmly. Of course you can, she said. And I bet even more people will come by now to support what you're doing. Marcus grinned, the brightness returning to his face. Yeah, I think so too. As the evening continued, Jasmine felt the weight of the day slowly lifting. The hurt was still there, but it had been softened by Marcus's optimism and Karen's apology. There was still work to be done, conversations to be had, wounds to heal, but for now they had taken the first step. The next morning, the sun rose on a quiet street, and once again Marcus set up his lemonade stand. But this time, something was different. Neighbors who had stayed silent the day before now came out to show their support. Mrs. Ortega walked by with her husband, giving Marcus a proud thumbs up. A few other families from the street came over, chatting with Jasmine while their children bought lemonade. Even Mr. Green stopped by, shaking Marcus's hand with a twinkle in his eye. I told you, you're doing a good thing, kid, he said with a smile. Keep it up. The atmosphere was light and friendly, a far cry from the tension of the day before. But one thing hadn't changed. Karen had not yet shown her face. Jasmine noticed this but didn't mention it to Marcus. She knew that Karen still had a long way to go before she could truly understand the hurt she had caused, and Jasmine was willing to give her the space to figure that out. And then, just as the day was winding down, Karen appeared. She walked slowly down the sidewalk, clutching a few dollar bills in her hand, her face set in a mix of nervousness and determination. As she approached the stand, the neighbors who had gathered fell silent, watching the interaction closely. Karen stopped in front of Marcus, her hand trembling slightly as she handed him the money. I'll take a cup of lemonade, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. Marcus looked up at his mom, who gave him a gentle nod of encouragement. He poured Karen a cup of lemonade and handed it to her, his young face unreadable. Karen took it with shaking hands, giving Marcus a small, tentative smile. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Marcus nodded politely, and with that Karen turned and walked away, her steps slow but steady. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Jasmine watched her go, feeling a sense of closure settle over her. The neighborhood had changed that day in ways big and small. Some wounds would take time to heal, and some people, like Karen, still had a long way to go. But for now, the first steps had been taken, and that was enough. As the sun began to set on another summer day, Marcus smiled up at his mom. I think today was a good day, he said, his voice filled with the pure optimism that only a child could have. Jasmine smiled, wrapping her arm around her son's shoulders. Yeah, baby, she said softly. It was a good day.